Now, to begin with, it's important to understand what we mean by cultural competence. Culture refers to integrated patterns of human behaviour that include things like language, thoughts, actions, customs, and the beliefs of an individual. It's a value and belief system which determines the way an individual views and makes sense of the world. Because of that, it's multidimensional and a continuous process because a person's value and belief system will be influenced by various elements of their identity, such as their religion and how much they follow that religion, their ethnicity, their age, their gender, their life experiences, where they grew up, so on and so forth. Competence implies having the capacity to function effectively, either as an individual or an organisation, or even within a team, within the context of those cultural beliefs, practices, and the belief systems that are presented by people and their communities. Cultural competence, therefore, is more than just having an awareness of someone's cultural norms. It's an approach that values diversity and promotes inclusivity, thus representing a value-based perspective that recognises individuality. It requires self-awareness, cultural knowledge and skills to foster culturally effective and ethical communications, interactions and relationships with people of various cultural backgrounds. It also requires an element of cultural humility, and this is a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and the awareness that one's culture or one's own culture is not the only one or necessarily the best one. So how is this relevant in research? Now, for some studies, recruiting a researcher from the same background as the participants may improve recruitment and the overall research experience. However, as evidenced in the literature and from our focus group with BAME community members to find out what would encourage them to take part in research, it's not one's ethnic identity that matters, but rather their ability to be culturally competent. As one community member stated, it's about respect and trust. If I'm going to share intimate details with you, I need to firstly know I can trust you. Communication is more than just verbal language. Like most interactions, it's someone's approach which gets attention, their ability to listen and be respectful. This was also echoed by one of the researchers in our focus groups who said, ticking the language box just isn't enough. A researcher needs to be culturally aware, not just of the community's culture, but of their own too, and how that can impact on the research. Now, as we become more knowledgeable and appreciative of the importance of being culturally competent and responsive, the need for education and training in this area also increases. Now, although cultural competence as a concept has been around quite a while, training in this area is actually yet to be validated. Quite often, training is delivered discussing the cultural norms and sensitivities within communities, which is then construed as cultural competence, and it is so much more than that. To be culturally competent, as I've said, you have to have more than just an awareness of cultural norms and practices. Though these are certainly helpful, training for cultural competence in research should focus on a process of self-evaluation and reflection to ensure that the subconscious prejudices and stereotypes we may hold towards communities do not impact on the research process. Now, let me share with you an example of this, which, although happened in practice, can be transferable within the context of research. A care home in a predominantly white British area had its first Muslim resident. She was fluent in Urdu and understood basic English, although couldn't speak it very well. Although after a few months the carers developed good relationships with this lady, the difficulties in communicating with her were becoming apparent. The care home therefore advertised for an Urdu-speaking care worker to ensure that she has access to the same quality of care as the other residents, and they were successful in the appointment of a female Urdu-speaking lady who was also Muslim by background. By now, the resident had her routine and had settled in well. On a Friday evening, she liked a glass of red wine and would often sit and listen to music. One Friday evening, she was sat with her glass of wine and the newly employed Muslim care worker approached her and told her that the wine is haram and she will go to hell. It is to no surprise, therefore, that in our research, BAME community members stated that often they do not want the researcher to be from the same community as them, especially if the subject being researched is considered taboo, for example, mental health. It is easy to assume that if a person is from the same community as the participants, language and cultural barriers will be defeated. However, as evidenced from this example, quite often people bring their own cultural biases and prejudices into practice and research. Now, cultural competence works both at an individual and organisational level, as I've stated. It recognises that culture changes, as do human beings, and that it changes in both obvious and more subtle ways. Cultural competence, therefore, is a continuous process, so learning someone's norms and their practices is not enough. It's recognising that these norms and practices can also change with the individual as they change as a person. Now, a culturally competent researcher will actively develop and practice appropriate, relevant, and sensitive strategies and skills in working with individuals, taking into account their cultural background. It's important that the researcher's approach takes into account life experiences and cultural values of the participants, which will build trust and rapport, which is a really important component for research with BAME communities. Now, a useful starting point to the development is to get to know the communities you are preparing to work with, establish contacts with the community, faith and voluntary sector organisations. If you needed to complete your research quickly, you could quickly get on board people who are either knowledgeable, i.e. have experience of conducting research in this area, or a part of the communities you are researching, even if it's just one or two people because you may be against the clock. These people could form part of a steering group or an advisory group for the research study and guide you through the various ways you can access and approach the community. To minimise any possibilities of interviewer or cultural bias, you could either develop a peer review group or utilise the research team to have a go at analysing segments of the collected data to compare and contrast the interpretations of the data. This is also another important component of culturally competent research, is to not assume that every factor is related to a person's cultural background, that there are other diversity factors in play, and that's important that the research takes a person-centred and holistic approach to the individual or the phenomenon being studied, so that it is clear what is cultural and what is because of a different issue, i.e. a socio-economic factor, for example. To summarise, to encourage cultural competency in the conduct of your research, you should think about developing a peer review group to help analyse and interpret the data, utilise reflective diaries as a process of self-awareness and self-evaluation, select an individual or a number of individuals to guide you through the research process, ensuring that the way in which you are looking to access and approach the community is culturally correct and appropriate. Make sure that you address issues of cultural bias to avoid the tendency to judge another culture or a group of people solely by the values and standards of one's own cultural background. We all do this subconsciously, so this is something that requires a lot of reflection, even if it's just very quick conversations with your research team about what you think particular issues were being raised. out of certain data, and understanding where you fit within that research. Avoid the effects of stigma by considering whether the topic being researched is considered taboo, and if it is, please take time and due consideration to ensure that consideration is given to such sensitive issues and that they are dealt with appropriately. And of course, develop advanced communication skills, especially where there is an interpreter being used. This should be standard protocol of research training, which requires researchers, especially qualitative researchers, to possess excellent non-verbal communication skills.